Should be dark and mysterious for this chapter.
Yeah. Just me that it's going to happen.
Chapter 9. At the Sign of the Prancing Pony. Bree was the chief village of the Bree-land, a small, inhabited region like an island in the empty lands round about. Besides Bree itself, there was Straddle on the other side of the hill, Combe in a deep valley a little further eastward, and Archet at the edge of the Chetwood forest. Lying around Bree Hill and the villages was a small country of fields and tamed woodlands, only a few miles broad. The men of Bree were brown-haired, broad, and rather short. Cheerful and independent, they belonged to nobody but themselves. But they were more friendly and familiar with hobbits, dwarves, elves, and the other inhabitants of the world about them than was or is usual with big people. According to their own tales, they were the original habitants and were the descendants of the first men that ever wandered into the west out of the middle world. Few had survived the turmoil of the elder days, but when the kings returned again over the great sea, they had found the Bree men still there, and they were still there now, when the memory of the old kings had faded into the grass. In those days, no other men had settled dwellings so far west, or within 100 leagues of the Shire. But in the wild lands beyond Bree, there were mysterious wanderers. The Bree folk called them rangers, and knew nothing of their origin. They were taller and darker than the men of Bree, and were believed to have strange powers of sight and hearing, and to understand the languages of beasts and birds. They roamed at will, southwards and eastwards, even as far as the Misty Mountains. But they were now few and rarely seen. When they appeared, they brought news from afar and told strange, forgotten tales, which were eagerly listened to, but the Bree folk did not make friends with them. There were also many families of hobbits in the Bree-land, and they claimed to be the oldest settlement of hobbits in the world, one that was founded long before even the Brandywine was crossed and the Shire colonized. They mostly lived in Straddle, though there were some in Bree itself, especially on the higher slopes of the hill above the houses of the men. The big folk and the little folk, as they called one another, were on friendly terms, minding their own affairs in their own ways, but both rightly regarding themselves as necessary parts of the Bree folk. Nowhere else in the world was this particular but excellent arrangement to be found. The Bree folk, big and little, did not themselves travel much, and the affairs of the four villages were their chief concern. Occasionally, the hobbits of Bree went as far as Buckland or the East Farthing, but though their little land was not much further than a day's ride east of the Brandywine Bridge, the hobbits of the Shire now seldom visited it. An occasional Bucklander or adventurous took would come out of the inn for a night, out to the inn for a night or two, but even that was becoming less and less usual. The Shire hobbits referred to those of Bree and to any others who lived beyond the borders as outsiders, and took very little interest in them, considering them dull and uncouth. There were probably many more outsiders scattered about in the west of the world in those days than the people of the Shire even imagined. Some, doubtless, were no better than tramps, ready to dig a hole in any bank and stay only as long as it suited them. But in the Bree-land, at any rate, these hobbits were decent and prosperous, and no more rustic than most of their distant relatives inside. It was not yet forgotten that there had been a time when there was much coming and going between the Shire and Bree. There was Bree blood in the Brandybucks, by all accounts. The village of Bree had some 100 stone houses of the big folk, mostly above the road, nestling on the hillside with windows looking west. On that side, running in more than half a circle from the hill and back to it, there was a deep dike with a thick hedge on the on the inner side. Over this, the road crossed by a causeway. but where it pierced the hedge, it was barred by a great gate. There was another gate in the southern corner where the road ran out of the village. The gates were closed at nightfall, but just inside them there were small lodges for the gatekeepers. Down on the road, where it swept to the right to go round the foot of the hill, there was a large inn. It had been built long ago, when the traffic on the roads had been far greater, for Bree stood at an old meeting of ways. Another ancient road crossed the east road just outside the dike at the western end of the village, and in former days men and other folk of various sorts had travelled much on it. Strange as news from Bree was still a saying in the East Farthing, descending from those old days when news from the north, south, and the east could all be heard at this inn, and when the shire hobbits used to go out more often to hear it. But the northern lands had long been desolate, and the north road was now seldom used. It was grass grown. The Bree folk called it the Greenway. The inn of Bree was still there, however, and the innkeeper was an important person. His house was a meeting place for the idle, the talkative, the inquisitive amongst the inhabitants, large and small, of the four villages, and a resort for rangers and other wanderers, and for such travelers, mostly dwarfs, as still journeyed on the east road to and from the mountains. It was dark. White stars were shining, and Frodo and his companions came at last to the Greenway crossing and drew near to the village. They came to the west gate, and they found it shut. But at the door of the lodge beyond it there was a man sitting. He jumped up and fetched a lantern and looked over the gate at them in surprise. "What do you want? Where do you come from?" he asked gruffly. "We are making for the inn here," answered Frodo. "We are journeying east and cannot go further tonight." "Hobbits? 4 hobbits? And what's more, out of the Shire by their talk," said the gatekeeper, speaking as if to himself. He stared at them darkly for a moment, and then slowly opened the gate and let them ride through. "We don't often see Shire folk riding on the road at night," he went on, as they halted a moment by the door. "You'll pardon my wondering what business takes you away east of Bree. What might your names be, might I ask?" "Our names and our business are our own, and this does not seem a good place to discuss them," said Frodo, not liking the look of the man or the tone of his voice. "Your business is your own, no doubt," said the man. "But it's my business to ask questions after nightfall." "We are hobbits from Buckland. We have a fancy to travel and to stay at the inn here," put in Merry. "I am Mr. Brandybuck. Is that enough for you? The Bree folk used to be fair spoken to travelers, or so I had heard." All right," said the man. "I meant no offense, but you'll find many more folk that old Harry at the gate will be asking you questions. There's queer folk about. If you go on to the pony, you'll find you're not the only guests." He wished them good night, and they said no more. But Frodo could see in the lantern light that the man was still eyeing them curiously. He was glad to hear the gate clang to behind them as they rode forward. He wondered why the man was so suspicious, and whether anyone had been asking for news about a party of hobbits. Could it have been Gandalf? He might have arrived while they were delayed in the forest and on the downs. But there was something in the look and the voice of the gatekeeper that made him uneasy. The man stared after the hobbits for a moment, and then he went back to his house. As soon as his back was turned, a dark figure climbed quickly in over the gate and melted into the shadows of the village street. What music should play right there? The hobbits rode on up a gentle slope, passing a few detached houses, and drew up outside the inn. The houses looked large and strange to them. Sam stared up at the inn with its 3 stories and many windows and felt his heart sink. He had imagined himself meeting giants taller than trees and other creatures even more terrifying some time or other in the course of his journey, but at the moment he was finding his first sight of men and their tall houses quite enough. Indeed, too much for the dark end of a tiring day. He pictured black horses standing all saddled up in the shadows of the inn yard, and black riders peering out of the dark upper windows. "We surely aren't going to stay here for the night, are we, sir?" he exclaimed. "If there are hobbit folk in these parts, why don't we look for some that would be willing to take us in? It'd be more home-like." "What's wrong with the inn?" said Frodo. "Tom Bombadil recommended it. I expect it's home-like enough inside." Even from the outside, the inn looked a pleasant house to familiar eyes. It had a front on the road and two wings running back on the land, partly cut out of the lower slopes of the hill, so that at the rear the second floor windows were level with the ground. There was a wide arch leading into a courtyard between these two wings, and on the left, under the arch, there was a large doorway reached by a few broad steps. The door was open, light was streaming out of it, and above the arch there was a lamp, and beneath the lamp swung a large signboard. A fat white pony reared up on its hind legs. Over the door was painted in white letters, "The Prancing Pony by Barlaman Butterbur." Many of the lower windows showed lights behind thick curtains. As they hesitated outside in the gloom, someone began singing a merry song inside, and many cheerful voices joined loudly into the chorus. They listened to this encouraging sound for a moment, and then got off their ponies. The song ended, and there was a burst of laughter and clapping. They led their ponies under the arch, and leaving them standing in the yard, they climbed up the steps. Frodo went forward and nearly bumped into a short, fat man with bald head and a red face. He had a white apron on and came bustling out the door and in through another, carrying a tray laden full of mugs. "Can we—" began Frodo. "Half a minute, if you please," shouted the man over his shoulder, and vanishing into a babble of voices and a cloud of smoke. In a moment he was out again, wiping his hands on his apron. "Good evening, little master," he said, bending down. "What may you be wanting?" "Beds for 4, and stabling for 5 ponies, if that could be managed. Are you Mr. Butterbur?" "That's right. Barlaman is my name. Barlaman Butterbur at your service. You're from the Shire, eh?" he said. And then suddenly he clapped his hand onto his forehead, as if trying to remember something. "Hobbits?" he cried. "Now what does that remind me of? Might I ask your names, sirs?" "Mr. Took and Mr. Brandybuck," said Frodo, "and this is Sam Gamgee. My name is Underhill." "There now," said Mr. Butterbur, snapping his fingers. "Oh, it's gone again. But it'll come back when I have time to think. I am run off my feet, but I'll see what I can do for you. We don't often get a party out of the Shire nowadays, and I should be sorry not to make you welcome. But there is such a crowd already in the house tonight, as there hasn't been for long enough. It never rains but it pours, we say in Bree. Hey, Nob!" he shouted. "Where are you, you woolly-footed slow-coached Nob?" "Coming, sir, coming." A cheery-looking hobbit bobbed out of the door, and seeing the travelers, stopped short and stared at them with great interest. "Where's Bob?" asked the landlord. "You don't know? Well, find him double sharp. I haven't got 6 legs nor 6 eyes neither. Tell Bob there's 5 ponies that must be stabled, and he must find room somehow." Nob trotted off with a grin and a wink. "Well, now, what was I going to say?" said Mr. Butterbur, tapping his forehead. "One thing drives out another, so to speak. I'm that busy tonight, my head's going right round. There's a party that come up the Green Way from the south last night, and that were strange enough to begin with. And then there's a traveling company of dwarves going west coming this evening, and now there's you. If you weren't hobbits, I would doubt that we could even house you. But we've got a room or two in the north wing that made special for hobbits when this place was built. On the ground floor, as they usually prefer, round windows and all as they like it. I hope you'll be comfortable. You'll be wanting supper, I no doubt, as soon as may be. This way now." And he led them a short way down a passage and opened a door. "Here's a nice little parlor," he said. "I hope it will suit. Excuse me now, but I am that busy. No time for talking. I must be trotting. It is hard work for 2 legs, but I don't get thinner. I'll look in again later. If you want anything, ring the handbell and Nob will come. If you don't come, ring it and shout." And off he went at last, and he left them feeling rather breathless. He seemed capable of an endless stream of talk, however busy he might be. They found themselves in a small, cozy room. There was a bit of bright fire burning in the hearth, and in front of it there were some low, comfortable chairs. There was a round table, already spread with a white cloth, and upon it a large hand bell. But Nob, the hobbit servant, came bustling in long before they even thought about ringing it. He brought candles and a tray full of plates. "Will you be wanting anything to drink, masters?" he said. "And shall I show you to the bedrooms while your suppers got ready?" They were washed, and in the middle of good deep mugs of beer when Mr. Butterbur and Nob came in again, and in the twinkling the table was laid. There was hot soup, cold meat, blackberry tart, new loaves, slabs of butter, half of a ripe cheese, good plain food, as good as the Shire could show, and homelike enough to dispel the last of Sam's misgivings, already much relieved by the excellence of the beer. The landlord hovered round for a little, and then prepared to leave them. "Well, I don't know whether you would care to join the company once you've supped," he said, standing by the door. "Perhaps you would rather go to your bed. Still, the company would be very pleased to welcome you if you had a mind. We don't get outsiders, travellers from the Shire, I should say, begging your pardon, often, and we would like to hear a bit of news or any story or song if you have one in mind. But as you please, ring the bell if you lack anything." So refreshed and encouraged did they all feel at the end of their supper, about 3/4 of an hour's steady going, not hindered by unnecessary talk, that Frodo, Pippin, and Sam decided to join the company. Mary said it would be too stuffy. "I shall sit here quietly by the fire for a bit, and perhaps go out later for a sniff of the air. Mind your P's and Q's, and don't forget, you're supposed to be escaping in secret, and are still on the high road, and not very far from the Shire." "All right," said Pippin. "Mind yourself. Don't get lost. And don't forget, it's safer indoors." The company was in the big common room of the inn. The gathering was large and mixed, as Frodo discovered when his eyes got used to the light. This came chiefly from a blazing log fire, for the 3 lamps hanging up from the beams were dim and half veiled in smoke. Barlaam Butterbur was standing near the fire, talking to a couple of dwarves and 1 or 2 strange-looking men. On the benches were various folk, men of Bree, a collection of local hobbits sitting chattering together, a few more dwarves, and other vague figures difficult to make out in the shadows of the corners. As soon as the Shire hobbits entered, there was a chorus of "Welcome" from the Bree-landers. The strangers, especially those who had come up the greenway, stared at them curiously. The landlord introduced the newcomers to the Bree folk so quickly that though they caught many names, they were seldom sure who the names actually belonged to. The men of Bree seemed all to have rather botanical, and to the Shire folk, odd-sounding names like Rushlight and Goatleaf and Heathertoes and Appledore and Thistlewool and Ferny, not to mention Butterbur. But some of the hobbits had similar names. The mugworts, for instance, seemed numerous, but most of them had natural names, such as Banks, Brockhouse, Longhole, Sandheaver, and Tunnelly. Many of these were also used in the Shire, and there were several Underhills from Stadel. And as they could not imagine sharing a name without being related, they took Frodo to their hearts as if he were a long-lost cousin. The Bree hobbits were, in fact, friendly and inquisitive, and Frodo soon found that some explanation of what he was doing would have to be given. He gave out that he was interested in history and geography, at which there was much wagging of heads, although neither of these words were much used in the Bree dialect. He said that he was thinking of writing a book, at which there was silent astonishment. And he said that his friends wanted to collect information about hobbits living outside the Shire, especially in the eastern lands. At this, a chorus of voices broke out. If Frodo had really wanted to write a book, and he had many ears. He would have learned enough for several chapters in just a few minutes. But if that was not enough, he was given a whole list of names, beginning with old Barlaman here, to whom he could go for further information. But after a time, as Frodo did not show any sign of actually writing his book on the spot, the hobbits returned to their questions about doings in the Shire. Frodo did not prove very communicative, and he soon found himself sitting alone in a corner, listening and looking around. The men and the dwarves were mostly talking of distant events and telling news of a kind that was becoming only too familiar. There was trouble away in the south, and it seemed that the men who had come up the Greenway were on the move, looking for lands where they could find some peace. The Bree folk were sympathetic, but plainly not very ready to take in large numbers of strangers in their little land. One of the travelers, a squint-eyed, ill-favored fellow, was foretelling that more and more people would be coming north in the near future. If room isn't found for them, they'll find it for themselves. They've a right to live, same as other folk, he said loudly. The local inhabitants did not look pleased at this prospect. The hobbits did not pay much attention to all of this, as it did not, at the moment, seem to concern hobbits. Big folk could hardly beg for lodging in hobbit holes. They were more interested in Sam and Pippin, who were now feeling quite at home and were chatting gaily about events in the Shire. Pippin roused a good deal of laughter with an account of the collapse of the roof of the town hall at Michael Delving. Will Whitfoot the mayor and the fattest hobbit in the West Farthing had been buried in chalk and come out looking like a floured dumpling. But there were several questions asked that made Frodo a little uneasy. One of the Bree-landers, who seemed to have been in the Shire several times, wanted to know where the Underhills lived and who they were related to. Suddenly Frodo noticed that a strange-looking, weather-beaten man sitting in the shadows near the wall was also listening intently to the hobbit talk. He had a tall tankard in front of him, and was smoking a long-stemmed pipe curiously carved. His legs were stretched out before him, showing high boots of supple leather that fitted him well, but had seen much wear, and were now caked with mud. A travel-stained cloak of heavy dark green cloth was drawn close about him, and in spite of the heat of the room, he wore a hood that overshadowed his face, but the gleam of his eyes could be seen as he watched the hobbits. "Who is that?" Frodo asked when he got a chance to whisper to Mr. Butterbur. "I don't think you introduced him." "Him?" said the landlord, also answering in a whisper, cocking an eye without turning his head. "I don't rightly know. He is one of the wandering folk. Rangers, we call them. He seldom talks, but not what he could tell a rare tale when he has his mind. He disappears for a month or a year, and then he pops up again. He was in, and he was out pretty often last spring, but I ain't seen him about lately. What his right name is, I never heard, but we know round here him as Strider. Goes about at a great pace with his long shanks, though he don't tell nobody what cause he has to hurry. But there's no accounting for east or west, as we say in Bree, meaning the Rangers and the Shire folk, begging your pardon. Funny you should ask about him." But at that moment Mr. Butterbur was called away by a demand for more ale, and so his last remark remained unexplained. Frodo found that Strider was now looking at him, as if he had heard, or guessed, all that had been said. Presently, with a wave of his hand and a nod, he invited Frodo to come over and sit by him. As Frodo drew near, he threw back his hood, showing a shaggy head of dark hair flecked with gray, and in a pale, stern face a pair of keen gray eyes. "I am called Strider," he said in a low voice. "I am very pleased to meet you, Master Underhill, if old Butterbur got your name right." "He did," said Frodo stiffly. He felt far from comfortable under the stare of those keen eyes. "Well, Master Underhill, said Strider, if I were you, I should stop your young friends from talking too much. Drink, fire, and chance meeting are pleasant enough, but, well, this isn't the Shire. There are queer folk about, though I say it as shouldn't, you may think. Though I say it as shouldn't, you may think, he added with a wry smile, seeing Frodo's glance. I think that must be some British thing about it's strange that I would be the one saying that because he looks like strange folk. But though I say it as shouldn't, that's how it's written, that's how I read it. It's confusing as all get out. And there have been even stranger travelers through Bree lately, he went on, watching Frodo's face. Frodo returned his gaze, but said nothing, and Strider made no further sign. His attention seemed suddenly to be fixed on Pippin. To his alarm, Frodo became aware that the ridiculous young Took, encouraged by his success with the fat mare of Michael Delving, was now actually giving a comical account of Bilbo's farewell party. He was already giving an imitation of the speech, and was drawing near to the astonishing disappearance. Frodo was annoyed. It was a harmless enough tale, for most of the local hobbits, no doubt, just a funny story about funny people way beyond the river. But some, old Butterbur, for instance, knew a thing or two, and had probably heard rumors long ago about Bilbo's vanishing, and it would bring the name of Baggins to their minds, especially if there had been inquiries in Bree after the name. Frodo fidgeted, wondering what to do. Pippin was evidently much enjoying the attention that he was getting, and he had become quite forgetful of the danger. Frodo had a sudden fear that in his present mood he might even mention the ring, and that might well be disastrous. You had better do something quick, whispered Strider into his ear. Frodo jumped up and stood upon the table and began to talk. The attention of Pippin's audience was disturbed. Some of the hobbits looked at Frodo and laughed and clapped, thinking that Mr. Underhill had taken as much ale as was good for him. Frodo suddenly felt very foolish and found himself, as was his habit when making a speech, fingering the things in his pocket. He felt the ring upon the chain, and quite unaccountably the desire came over him to slip it on and vanish out of this silly situation. It seemed to him somehow as if the suggestion came to him from outside, from someone or something in the room. He resisted the temptation firmly. He clasped the ring in his hand as if to keep a hold on it and prevent it from escaping or doing any mischief. At any rate, it gave him no inspiration. He spoke a few suitable words, as they would have said in the Shire. We are all very much gratified by the kindness of your reception, and I venture to hope that my brief visit will help to renew the old ties of friendship between the Shire and Bree. And then he hesitated and coughed. Everyone in the room was now looking at him. A song! Shouted one of the hobbits. A song! A song! Shouted all the others. Come on now, master, sing us something that we haven't heard before. And for a moment, Frodo stood gaping. Then, in desperation, he began a ridiculous song that Bilbo had been rather fond of, and indeed rather proud of, for he had made up the words himself. It was about an inn, and that is probably why it came to Frodo's mind just then. Here it is in full. Only a few words of it are now, as a rule, remembered. There is an inn, and a merry old inn, beneath an old grey hill, and there they brew a beer so brown that the man in the moon himself came down one night to drink his fill. An ostler has a tipsy cat that plays a five-string fiddle, and up and down he runs his bow, now squeaking high, now purring low, now sawing in the middle. The landlord keeps a little dog, and is mighty fond of jokes. When there's good cheer among his guests, he cocks an ear at all the jests and laughs until he chokes. They also keep a horned cow as proud as any queen, but music turns her head like ale, and makes her wave her tufted tail and dance upon the green. And oh, the rows of silver dishes and the store of silver spoons. For Sunday there's a special pair, and these they polish up with care on Saturday afternoons. The man in the moon was drinking deep, and the cat began to wail. A dish and a spoon on the table danced, and the cow in the garden madly pranced, and the little dog chased his tail. The man in the moon took another mug, and then rolled beneath his chair, and there he dozed, and dreamed of ale, till in the sky the stars turned pale, and dawn was in the air. Then the ostler said to his tipsy cat, "The white horses of the moon, they neigh and champ with their silver bits, but their master's been and drowned his wits, and the sun will be rising soon." And so the cat on his fiddle played "Hey diddle diddle," a jig that would wake the dead. And he squeaked and he sawed and he quickened his tune, while the landlord shook the man in the moon. "It's after 3," he said. They rolled the man slowly up the hill and bundled him into the moon, while his horses galloped up in rear, and the cow came capering like a deer, and the dish ran up with a spoon. Now quicker the fiddle went deedle-dum-diddle, and the dog began to roar, and the cow and the horse stood on their heads. The guests all bounded from their beds and danced upon the floor. With a ping and a pong, the fiddle strings broke, and the cow jumped over the moon, and the little dog laughed to see such fun, and the Saturday dish went off at a run with a silver Sunday spoon. And the round moon rolled behind the hill. As the sun raised up her head, she hardly believed her fiery eyes, for though it was day, to her surprise, they all went back to bed. There was a loud, long applause. Frodo had a good voice, and the song tickled their fancy. "Where's old Barley?" they cried. "He ought to hear this. Bob ought to learn about this cat and the fiddle, and we'll all have a dance." They called for more ale, and they began to shout, "Let's have it again, master! Come on now, once more!" And they made Frodo have another drink. And then he began his song again, while many of them joined in, for the tune was well known, and they were quick at picking up words. It was now Frodo's turn to feel pleased with himself, and he capered about on the table, and when he came a second time to the cow jumped over the moon, he leapt into the air, much too vigorously, for he came down bang into a tray full of mugs, and slipped and rolled off the table with a crash, clatter, and bump. The audience all opened their mouths wide from laughter, and stopped short, gaping in silence, for the singer disappeared. He simply vanished, as if he had gone slap right through the floor and not left behind a hole. The local hobbits stared in amazement, sprang to their feet, and shouted for Barliman. All the company drew away from Pippin and Sam, who found themselves left alone in a corner, eyed darkly and doubtfully from a distance. It was plain that many people regarded them now as companions of a traveling magician of unknown power and purpose. But there was one swarthy Bree-lander who stood looking at them with a knowing, half-mocking expression that made them feel very uncomfortable. Presently he slipped out the door, followed by that squint-eyed southerner, and the two had been whispering together a good deal during the evening, and Frodo felt a fool. Not knowing what else to do, he crawled away under the table to the dark corner by Strider, who sat there unmoved, giving no sign of his thoughts, and Frodo leaned back against the wall and took off the ring. How it came to be on his finger he could not tell. He could only suppose that he had been handling it in his pocket while he was singing, and somehow had slipped it on when he stuck out his hand with a jerk to stop his fall. For a moment he wondered if the ring itself had not played him a trick. Perhaps it had tried to reveal itself in response to some wish or command that was felt in the room. He did not like the looks of the men who had gone out. "Well," said Strider when he reappeared, "why did you do that? Worse than anything your friends could have said. You put your foot right in it. Or should I say your finger?" "I don't know what you mean," said Frodo, annoyed and alarmed. "Oh, yes, you do," answered Strider. "But we had better wait until the uproar has died down. Then, if you please, Mr. Baggins, I should like a quiet word with you." "What about?" asked Frodo, ignoring the sudden use of his proper name. "A matter of some importance to us both." answered Strider, looking Frodo in the eye. You may hear something to your advantage. Very well, said Frodo, trying to appear unconcerned. I will talk to you later. Meanwhile, an argument was going on by the fireplace. Mr. Butterbur had come trotting in, and he was now trying to listen to several conflicting accounts of the event at the same time. I saw him, Mr. Butterbur, said a hobbit. Leastways, I didn't see him, if you take my meaning. He just vanished into thin air, in a manner of speaking. You don't say, Mr. Mugwort, said the landlord, looking puzzled. Yes, I do, replied Mugwort. And I mean what I say, what's more. Well, there's some mistake somewhere, said Butterbur, shaking his head. There's too much of that Mr. Underhill to go vanishing into thin air, or even into thick air, as is more likely in this room. Well, then where's he now? Cried several voices. Well, how should I know? He's welcome to go where he will, so long as he pays in the morning. Here's Mr. Took. He's not vanished. Well, I saw what I saw, and I saw what I didn't, said Mugwort obstinately. Well, I say there's some mistake, repeated Butterbur, picking up the tray and gathering all the broken crockery. Of course there's a mistake, said Frodo. I haven't vanished at all. Here I am. I was just having a few words with Mr. Strider here in the corner. He came forward into the firelight, but most of the company backed away, even more perturbed than before. They were not in the least satisfied by his explanation that he had crawled away quickly under the table after he had fallen. Most of the hobbits and the men of Bree went off in a huff, having no fancy for further entertainment that evening. One or two gave Frodo a black look and departed, muttering amongst themselves. The dwarves and the 2 or 3 strange men that still remained got up and said good night to the landlord, but not to Frodo or his friends. Before long, no one was left but Strider, who sat on unnoticed by the wall. Mr. Butterbur did not seem much put out. He reckoned, very probably, that his house would be full again on many future nights, until this present mystery had been thoroughly discussed. Now, what have you been doing, Mr. Underhill? He asked, frightening my customers and breaking up my crocks with your acrobatics. I am very sorry to have caused you any trouble, said Frodo. It was quite unintentional, I assure you. A most unfortunate accident. All right, Mr. Underhill. But if you're going to do any more tumbling and conjuring or whatever it was, you best warn folk beforehand. And warn me. We're a bit suspicious round here of anything out of the way or uncanny, if you understand me, and we don't take to it all of a sudden. Oh, I shan't be doing anything of the sort again, Mr. Butterbur, I promise you. And now I think I will be getting to bed. We shall be making an early start. Will you see that our ponies are ready by 8 o'clock? Very good, but before you go, I should like a word with you in private, Mr. Underhill. Something's just come back to my mind that I ought to tell you. I hope that you'll not take it amiss. When I have seen to a thing or two, I will come along to your room, if you're willing. Certainly, said Frodo, but his heart sank. He wondered how many private talks was he going to have before he finally got to bed, and what would they reveal to him? Were these people all in league against him? He began to suspect even old Butterbur's fat face was concealing dark designs. What do you think? That's the end of chapter 9. Hattie's pretending to be stricken with sleep.
No, she's got a cold and she feels terrible.
All right. Well, Judah, you were right last time, but you were wrong too, weren't you?
What? About what?
All right. That was the sign of the prancing pony. Next time, we'll be back for chapter 10 by the name of Strider.
I get this so much, it's like, the whole of it is up on the table, like, if this is the table, he would be like, this is